From London, I'm John Weeks, and this is The Standard. Victims and relatives affected by the infected blood scandal have vowed that their fight is not over yet, as the final report from the inquiry has been published today.
Our government knew that our blood was bad, and they still thought it was okay to give it to us. This is unacceptable. Stop the words, stop the rubbish, and do something!
During a demonstration in Parliament Square yesterday, they paid tribute to the people who've died as a result of the scandal, which has been described as the worst treatment disaster in NHS history. They were joined by Labour MP Dame Diana Johnson, who co-chairs the all-party parliamentary group on haemophilia and contaminated blood.
I hope that Parliament will have an opportunity to debate and hear from the Prime Minister as soon as possible about this, the biggest treatment disaster in the history of the NHS.
Tens of thousands of people were infected with contaminated blood between the 1970s and early 90s, prompting one of the largest public inquiries in UK history. More than 3,000 people have died and others have been left with lifelong health complications after being infected with viruses, including hepatitis C and HIV. Two interim reports published in July 2022 and April 2023 made recommendations about compensation for victims and their families, and the government has said it accepts the moral case for compensation, with interim payouts of £100,000 each already made to around 4,000 survivors and bereaved partners. Our health reporter Daniel Keane has been at Westminster to learn the findings of the final report and joins me now. So Dan, before this final report, we had already had two interim reports. What are the key points from this final one?
So this final report is essentially the biggest report to date and the most comprehensive. And it goes into a lot of detail about the extent to which the infected blood scandal was covered up by Whitehall officials and also the scale of the impact on people. And that's the key difference with previous reports. The sheer amount of evidence here wasn't contained in those previous two reports. And as such, it is so damaging for the government, for the NHS, and for Whitehall.
So of those damaging parts of this report, Dan, of the more shocking revelations, what stood out for you?
I think what stood out for me was how preventable all of it was. And that's what Sir Brian Langstaff goes into detail on. This entire scandal never should have happened. And it happened essentially because of oversight, arrogance, and laziness on the part of Whitehall officials, doctors. And I think while he stops short of saying it's a conspiracy, this was incompetence and medical arrogance and negligence on an industrial scale. And one of the things that he says is that successive governments did not put patient safety first. So this was a scandal that stretched across the NHS to Whitehall, to government ministers. And I think that's what really stood out to me.
And I understand Sir Brian Langstaff has in the past been quite clear on compensation. Was there any more on the recommended compensation going forwards?
So one of the main problems is that victims have waited so long for compensation, even after the previous two publications of interim reports. And one of the issues that the inquiry says has to be urgently resolved is the fact that so many of the victims no longer have medical records. These were either intentionally destroyed or they were lost in hospitals in the 1970s and 80s. So that means, in theory, you have thousands of people suffering from hepatitis and HIV who have no way of claiming any compensation. And that, I think, along with kind of expediting the speed of these payments, will be the key focus for the government. Now, what we've seen is Jeremy Hunt pledging very swift compensation, and we know the bill could go up to potentially £10 billion. But the noises coming from government indicate that they are taking this quite seriously.
So, Dan, how do you think the victims and the families of victims will respond to this final report?
Well, I think today will be a hugely emotional day. People will feel vindicated.
people that have suffered in silence for decades and been told that their problems are not important will feel like this is a significant step forward. But I think there will also be a lot of sadness and a lot of confusion at how this has taken so long. It's astonishing, really, to think that this was happening in the 1970s and 80s under the government's watch and the NHS's watch, and has taken until 2024 to resolve. And I think that the frustration and the anger, if anything, year by year has got worse. And it's reached kind of boiling point here. So there'll be mixed emotions, I think, today from families. And of course, many of them have loved ones who they will never be able to bring back and watch their health decline rapidly. So yes, definitely a mixed picture.
Our health reporter Daniel Keane there, discussing the final report from the infected blood inquiry. We're going to take a short break now. In part 2, we're joined by The Standard's Ethan Croft, who reveals Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer's favourite pubs in London. Joining me now is The Standard's Ethan Croft, who's written in today's Londoners' Diary column about Sir Keir Starmer's favourite London pubs. So Ethan, where are the Labour leader's favourite London drinking spots and why?
Well, all of Keir Starmer's favourite pubs cluster around two bits of North London. The first is Kentish Town, where he lives, and the other place is, of course, the Emirates, because Keir Starmer is a fanatical Arsenal fan. I was out yesterday in this particular area of North London and was quite shocked to see the Labour leader wander into a local pub called the Landseer Arms, about 5 minutes walk from the Emirates, with his security detail and with a few friends. He picked up a pint of bitter and took a seat at the back. Spoke to the landlord of the place, who told me that he's part of the furniture now, always comes in after the match. This pub is a backstreet boozer that's, far away enough from the Emirates to avoid the drunken crowds of singing football fans, but close enough for him to go there for a quick one after the game. Obviously, he was slightly disappointed as Arsenal missed out on the Premier League title yesterday. The other pubs that he really likes to frequent are, as I say, in Kentish Town, where he lives. His main one is the Pineapple, which he says is a brilliant local, and he tends to go in there every Christmas as a family tradition, and also, whenever he can get a free evening off, I think. It combines a sort of usual classic Victorian pub setup with a Thai restaurant and a conservatory at the back. Quite an interesting place. And the other is the Grafton Arms, which is also in Kentish Town, and it's quite close to the football pitch where Keir Starmer tends to still play five-a-side with a team of friends, and he's done that for a number of years, and they often go for a quick one after full time.
And I understand there's a bit of a drinking culture in Parliament in Westminster. Does Keir Starmer get involved with that as well?
It's interesting, actually. Starmer really doesn't seem to socialise in that way with other politicians. He really doesn't seem to be interested. It very much for him, I think, is a job. And when he goes into Westminster, he's not really spending his time skulking around the various parliamentary bars. He socialises with friends, he socialises with family, and then he works when he's with colleagues. There is a notable exception to that, of course, because when I saw him yesterday at this pub, the Landseer Arms, he was joined by the Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, who got a pint of lager in. So maybe for only the most favoured colleagues, they get to have a drink with party leader.
And it's interesting, isn't it, for a politician that's in the public eye to be doing a lot of these sort of everyman things. Do you think he'll want the public to see more of him at the pub and playing five-a-side, for example, so people can relate to him a bit better?
People in the Labour Party desperately say to journalists all the time that Keir Starmer is a normal guy, he's really funny, he's very down to earth, he likes to drink, he likes the football, and they think he really struggles to express this in the public eye, on radio and on television, and so the public don't really get that sense of him. And I think it's a big move before the general election to try and bring this part of his character out. You will have seen probably yesterday he was on a cooking programme on Channel 4 making a tandoori salmon. They're really trying to make him seem like more of a normal guy because he can seem a bit of a stuffy lawyer because of his previous career. The pub is part of that. I mean, politicians have an interesting relationship with it. It's often been the death knell of political campaigns before. I remember about 8 years ago when Zach Goldsmith was running as the Tory candidate for London Mayor, he was sort of caught on camera being unable to hold a pint of lager. He didn't quite know how to do it. It really makes you seem quite out of touch. if you can't sink a pint. Also, there's been a video doing the rounds recently of the former Deputy Prime Minister John Prescott being able to down a pint in about 3 seconds, which impressed people at the time. I think it's definitely a focal point, I think, over the next sort of 6 months before an election, making Keir seem like a normal guy. So maybe he should be inviting the cameras in with him rather than sitting at the back with his security detail.
Do you think he could make a move to do that? Do you think that could be sort of his golden ticket to winning the next general election?
I think there are probably other things on his side, to be honest, in terms of winning the next general election. But there's no harm in it seeming like a normal guy. I think Starmer remains quite a private person, to be honest. I think he struggles to express himself. I mean, even the fact that he's a huge Arsenal fan, I think most people find that difficult to believe. He's been caught out before on radio interviews where he's been asked questions about football and it sort of stumbles over it as though he's never seen a football before in his life, despite loving to watch the game and play the game, etc., etc. It will take a bit of media training, probably, but if people at the top of the Labour Party think it's worth it, I'm sure they'll put some effort into doing it.
There's more news, interviews and analysis in the Evening Standard newspaper and at standard.co.uk. Thanks for listening. We're back tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock.